You may remember this usage of the term when we were talking about real interest rates. The nominal interest rate was the interest rate that was announced, then you had to subtract off the inflation rate to get the real interest rate. Essentially the same issue arises here. Say that in 2004, GDP increased 4.4%. Nominal GDP did. Now, some of that increase is due to an actual increase in production of goods and services, and some of it is just due to inflation, the price of all goods being higher. As it turns out, in 2004, 2.2% of the overall 4.4% rise in GDP was just due to prices being higher. It was just due to inflation. And the other 2.2% was the real increase in goods and services being produced. When you're looking back over periods of time, it's always important to look at real GDP, adjusted for inflation. For example, if you look at the 1970s, when inflation is high in the United States, it looks like GDP is growing really, really fast. But if you adjust for inflation, then the record of growth doesn't look so amazing in that decade anymore. In the inflation lecture, a couple lectures down the road, we'll discuss how to adjust and how to measure real GDP in more detail. Now, GDP has its share of conceptual imperfections. In fact, one of the things I'll emphasize over and over in the next few lectures is that all economic statistics have a lot of conceptual imperfections. GDP is a measure of what is bought and sold. Thus, things that affect the quality of life but aren't bought or sold won't be directly included in GDP. Classic example, it's what economists call home production. Around the late 1960s and the early 1970s, there's an enormous surge of women into the paid workforce. As a result, many goods and services that had been produced at home before, and I'm thinking here of meals, house cleaning, child care, were now more likely to be bought and sold in the market. When those things were produced at home, they weren't being bought and sold, so they weren't counted in GDP. When they're produced in the market, then they were counted. But clearly that's a change which is not a real change in what happened in the economy. There are a lot of other things that affect people's standard of living, affect their happiness, but aren't something that's measured directly as something that's bought and sold. For example, leisure. Your time off is not valued by the market in any direct way. If everyone could have 10 hours a week off, or an extra 2 weeks of vacation every year, but output remained the same, GDP would not show any overall gain. The environment is not directly included in GDP because it's not bought and sold. Greater or lesser pollution doesn't show up in GDP measures. Stuff like traffic congestion or the time it takes to commute doesn't show up as something that's bought and sold, except in an indirect way like gasoline, the amount of gasoline that was needed. Certain bad things like, say, crime or natural disaster can lead to more economic activity. If there's a disaster and then you have to rebuild a large part of a city, that might make GDP look great, but it's a lower standard of living to have suffered through a disaster like that. Health is not directly included in GDP. The fact that people have longer life expectancies and are living healthier longer doesn't show up in any direct way. Only the healthcare services show up. Even within GDP, you might ask, if you were in a skeptical frame of mind, if everything bought and sold really deserves the same value, even if some things might seem to have different values in your mind. I mean, for example, is a bag of potato chips the same value as an organic fresh apple? Does Newsweek have the same value as a pornographic magazine? Is a ticket for admission to a violent movie exactly the same value as a ticket for admission to an art museum? Well, GDP is just about adding everything up. It's not about value judgments. Now, I don't want to minimize these issues about the linkage between GDP and standard of living. They matter, and in some cases they can matter a lot. I certainly don't recommend that we pursue GDP at all cost. I don't think everyone should work 60-hour weeks just so GDP could be higher, or that we should pollute the environment just so GDP should be higher, and I don't know any economist who would believe that. But it just shows you that GDP is something of a limited measure. When I was giving you the definition of GDP, I mentioned that it was the final product. The final product. What exactly does that word final mean? Well, GDP includes all the production of intermediate products. One question you can ask about GDP is, this list that I gave you, durable goods, non-durable goods, services, structures, doesn't that leave out a lot of stuff? I mean, what about the inputs? Like, what about the steel that goes into the cars, or the lumber that goes into the furniture, or the oil that goes into the gasoline? Where did that fit in somehow? Well, all production includes a combination of inputs that are turned into outputs. Making a car includes steel and petrochemicals and computer chips, all sorts of different materials. But all of these inputs are included in the final value of the car when it's sold. If I was going to add up the iron ore industry and the steel industry and the car industry, I would in effect be counting the iron multiple times. When it was first produced, then when it was in the steel, then when it was in the car. So I would be double counting or triple counting, depending on how many stages of production it went through. So the Bureau of Economic Analysis does create some very detailed tables that show all the inputs coming in and their value and the outputs coming out. But for calculating overall what an economy produces, you only need to add up the final product, because the value of the final product includes the earlier things that were produced. It's also true that transfers of ownership do not show up in GDP, not unless they involve new production. For example, say you sell a house and I buy it. Ownership has changed of the house, but nothing new was produced. So there's no addition to GDP. Only new construction of houses or physically fixing up the old ones adds to GDP. Or say that you sell some shares of stock in a company and I buy some shares of stock in a company. Well, ownership of the stock changed, but nothing new is produced. So the stockbroker's fee is included in GDP, but not the value of the stock that was bought and sold. So when the stock market rises or falls substantially, it literally has no direct effect on GDP at all. I mean, people are placing different values on shares of stock, but they're just buying and selling, and for every buyer, there's also a seller. So with all these limits, with all these concerns, with all these worries, at the same time, I don't want to lose what's worthwhile and measurable in GDP. Societies with higher per capita GDP tend to be better off in lots of dimensions. They have more personal consumption, and we shouldn't be snooty about personal consumption. That includes healthcare and education and all sorts of things that most of us value. It includes also that societies with high per capita GDP tend to have cleaner air and water. They tend to have a greater degree of personal security. A wise Nobel laureate from MIT named Robert Solow once said, "If you have to be obsessed by something, maximizing real national income is not a bad choice." Well, maybe it's best not to be obsessed by any one statistic, but GDP really does matter. Makes a big difference over time, and it's unwise to take these kinds of criticisms and run with them and pretend GDP just doesn't matter. The historical pattern of GDP shows a long-term upward trend over time, with occasional short-term dips for recessions. Imagine that you look back at the pattern of GDP over time, going back a half century or so, and let's specify that we're looking at real GDP. That is, it's GDP adjusted for inflation, so you're seeing the actual patterns of economic production. What does it look like? Well, from a long-term perspective, GDP increases substantially over time. After adjusting for inflation, GDP in the mid-2000s was 5.5 times as large as it was in 1950. So you can see it sloping up over time. If you take a long-term perspective, that average growth rate of real GDP from 1950 through 2004 was about 3.2% per year. However, this pattern of growth in GDP is not a straight line, just 3.2% gained every single year. Instead, when you look at the pattern of GDP over time, you see fluctuations around this long-term trend. Sometimes the economy is below the average trend, sometimes it's a little above. In the 20th century, for example, the biggest dip in GDP was the Great Depression, especially the period from 1931 to 1933, when the economy contracted by about a third. Those dips are called recessions, and a recession is technically defined as a significant and lasting downturn in GDP. You sometimes hear people say a recession needs to be a downturn in GDP that lasts 6 months or more, or 2 quarters, but there's nothing official about that. The upward movements between recessions are sometimes called recoveries or upswings. From a long-term perspective, the upward trend in standard of living is the most obvious thing that happens with GDP. But if you're living in the middle of a recession, it's pretty obvious that that's happening too. So there's a difference there between the long run and the short run perspective. The starting and ending points of recessions are not defined by any U.S. government agency, but instead they're defined by a committee of academic economists at a nonprofit research institution called the National Bureau of Economic Research. NBER, as economists call it, is affiliated with lots of researchers who hold faculty positions at colleges and universities. It helps to some extent to fund their research, and it organizes conferences so they can meet with others working in their area and share ideas and criticize each other. The U.S. economy, according to the NBER data, had 22 recessions from 1900 up through the recession of 2001. So it had a recession on average about every 5 years. However, more recently, recessions have been somewhat more rare. There's one in the early 1980s, one in 1990-91, and one in 2001. So it seems like they've been more like 10 years apart recently. It also seems like the recent recessions have gotten somewhat shorter. From the start of the recession to the end, what economists call the peak to the trough, in 2001's recession was 8 months. It was also 8 months during the recession from 1990 into 1991. But the average length of the decline in the economy, if you look at the recession since World War II, was more like 10 months. And if you look at the interwar years, that is that time from World War I to World War II, which of course includes the Great Depression, the length of recessions then was 18 months. So it sort of seems as if the recessions are getting somewhat shorter over time, although that's not a certain conclusion. So with this idea of GDP firmly in mind, I want to give you some guidance as to how the discussion of macroeconomics is going to proceed from here. Macroeconomic policy can be summarized with 4 goals, a framework, and then 2 main sets of tools for accomplishing those goals. And as you look ahead through these lectures on macroeconomics, it's probably useful to have the structure of the discussion, the roadmap in mind. So let's first talk about the 4 goals of macroeconomic analysis. First goal is economic growth. In the long term, is the economy increasing per capita GDP? The next goal is low unemployment. How can the economy keep unemployment low on average, year in and year out? And during recessions, how can it keep unemployment from rising too high or for too long? Third goal, low inflation. How can government act in such a way as to keep inflation under control? And fourth goal, a sustainable balance of trade. Now, that word sustainable you may recognize as a bit of a fudge word, but what exactly does the balance of trade mean, and why does it matter that the U.S. is running enormous trade deficits in the mid-2000s? Now, with those 4 goals, and those will be the next 4 lectures, those 4 goals, we'll then introduce a framework for macroeconomic analysis. This framework is usually called the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. What that framework will do is it will help to organize the macroeconomic analysis in some of the same ways that basic supply and demand help to organize microeconomic analysis. But aggregate supply and aggregate demand are not just microeconomics. What they'll help us think about is what are the trade-offs between growth and unemployment and inflation and the balance of trade. So, with our 4 goals in mind, and our framework for thinking about how these are going to trade off against each other, we'll then be able to move to the 2 main tools of economic policy. And there are 2 main sets of tools for macroeconomic policy. They're broadly called fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is defined as government tax and spending policy, so the federal budget, budget deficits, and taxes and spending. Fiscal policy is, of course, decided by Congress, but needs to be signed by the President as well. So that'll give us a chance to discuss the issue of budget deficits and what happens when spending is larger than taxes. The other big area is monetary policy. Monetary policy refers to the policies of the Federal Reserve. We'll need to talk about what that is, of course, that affect interest rates and credit and how much money is being loaned and borrowed in the economy. The Federal Reserve decisions in monetary policy are decided by a central bank of political appointees. And so that will raise questions about when should they raise or when should they lower interest rates. And finally, we'll then, with all of this in mind, expand the scope of the discussion to international issues and consider global trade. Why trade can benefit economies, what the arguments are for restricting trade, issues of exchange rates, international movements of financial capital, and the evolving shape of the world economy.